All right, so I'd like to welcome everyone to this reproducibility showcase. My name is Jing Liu. I'm the MIDAS Managing Director. Because this is such a unique event, I want to give you a little bit of a background. MIDAS organized a reproducibility challenge earlier this year with the goal of promoting the good work of our colleagues and to showcase best practices and tools that our entire community can adopt. We received many wonderful submissions from across the campus, offering many different perspectives, including providing a definition of reproducibility and what can and should be reproduced, making comprehensive documentation that allows for others to reproduce the results in a particular project, developing general platforms for coding or running analyses that standardize the methods for reproducible results across studies, metadata, tools, and processes to improve the robustness of results in the presence of variations in data in the computational environment and human decisions, methods to test the consistency of results from multiple projects, and improving reproducibility with restricted data. So the judges have picked a number of teams to put together this virtual showcase. I want to stress here actually that it doesn't mean that the projects not chosen for the showcase are less good, but the projects featured in the showcase are particularly suitable for this format. The videos and slides of the showcase will be online, and you can go to the MIDAS website to check out videos of the previous presentations. We'll also build a resource collection online for interested people to check out what tools they can use. We also will have a reproducibility day on September 14th, where we'll announce the winners of the reproducibility challenge for them to receive cash awards. And there will also be presentations and panel discussions on that day. So today's webinar features two presentations. So I will introduce John's team first. John Silberholz is an assistant professor in the Ross School of Business here at University of Michigan. The two collaborators who will also present today are Ian Dunning, a researcher and team lead at Hudson River Trading, and Swati Gupta, assistant professor of industrial and systems engineering at Georgia Tech. Their presentation today is what works best when a systematic evaluation of heuristics for MaxCut and QUBO. In this project, they carried out a large-scale evaluation of heuristics for optimization problems. The judges of the reproducibility challenge liked this project particularly because it provides procedures and tools that other researchers can adopt to improve data transparency, analysis workflow, and to test the sensitivity of research findings to variations in data and in human decisions. So before I hand over to the speakers though, I want to remind the audience that you can put questions in the Q&A or in the chat box anytime during the talk. All right, John, please take away.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, hoping folks can see my screen here. Good. All right, fantastic. So I guess thanks so much for the introduction, Jing. Really appreciate you kind of organizing all of these events and so on, and kind of honored to be asked to give a talk here. And so you've already kind of introduced the team, so I think I'll jump right into the material for our talk. And so basically, in some sense, we were drawn to kind of a framework that shows up over and over and over again in real-world decision-making, right? There's some usually complex real-world problem, right? And kind of we as mathematical modelers seek to match it to a mathematical, optimization model that can help us pick good decisions in our contexts, right? So once you've kind of done that mathematical modeling step, right, you can turn to the literature, see, what's been done for this problem, and ideally, right, you're going to identify some algorithm that you think is going to work well in practice for your particular real-world problem. And so sometimes this goes very, very smoothly, right? Sometimes, kind of there's one dominant algorithm, or it's very clear between a couple of algorithms which one to apply. But I would say that often in practice, this algorithm, what you should actually be using for your problem that you're facing as a practitioner, is often rather challenging. And I'll explain why actually with an example that we use throughout this work, which is the MaxCut problem. So MaxCut is a classical problem. It's a problem that's been studied for a very, very long time. That comes up in all sorts of different applications. I'll actually touch on a couple of those toward the end of the talk. But in some sense, you take a graph, right? Nodes and edges. The edges can have weights. And you're trying to partition, split up the nodes into two groups, right? So I have the red and the blue nodes here on my slide. And the goal is to basically maximize the number of edges that are between the two groups, or if they're weighted, then the sum of the edge weights between the two groups. So in this particular image, we have these kind of red and blue nodes, and we're maximizing the number of red edges in our case, because the red edges are the ones that go from a red node to a blue node. The black edges are within the same color. And so, we know a lot about this problem. One important thing we know is that it's NP hard, which is a classification that tells us that as this problem gets very, very large, using current methods, we don't know how to solve these problems to optimality to get the best possible partitioning efficiently, okay? And so this has really led to a proliferation of heuristic approaches, right, which are in some sense approaches that don't seek to necessarily get the very best solution. They just seek to get good solutions fast, right? And these are incredibly important to practitioners, right? Because often their goal is to get a good solution fast to solve their real world problem, right? So this is very important. And there's a lot of heuristics research, right? Dozens and dozens of these have been published just over the last 10 years. And I would say well north at this point of 100 total heuristics have been published for this and a related problem called QUBO, which is kind of interchangeable with MaxCut. And we should note that because heuristics don't guarantee that they're giving you the best possible solution, computational evaluations are really essential, right, to kind of establish the value of a heuristic, right? You need to run the heuristic on instances and establish that indeed it gives you good solutions quickly, right? That's kind of why we're using heuristics in the first place. And so I would say very unfortunately, this computational evaluation actually historically hasn't been done all that well. And so a couple of reasons why. One is that historically, right, many different heuristics developers have all used the same standard test bed, right, which is a set of problem instances that kind of everyone tests on, and they say, okay, how well did I do? How quickly did I run? Right? And so I've plotted some characteristics over here on the left of our standard test bed, right? These instances that everyone is testing on. So the x-axis on a log scale is the number of nodes, and the y-axis is the density. So of all the possible edges between the nodes, the percentage of them with a non-zero edge weight. And so we can see down here on the bottom right, we have this cluster of points, all very, very sparse problem instances. And so our poor fellow over here on the right, if he's facing a high density instance, right, with a density that's much closer to 1, it seems pretty clear that at least current computational evaluation from the literature is not going to help him, right? Because in some sense, we haven't been testing on things that look anything like his problem instance, right? And so at first blush, this doesn't seem like such a big problem, right? You kind of say, no big deal. I'm going to take these heuristics from the literature, test them on instances that look like the instance we're looking at, these high density instances, see which one works best, and we're good to go, right? But this brings us to another really big problem, which is that our literature has actually very few heuristics are published with their source code, right? So in fact, we found that kind of across a wide range of heuristics, only 4% of them publish their source code along with the heuristic. And so it's not so trivial, right, to go back, take all these previous heuristics and test them out on a new instance, because we don't have the code, right? We'd have to kind of read through the papers, re-implement the heuristics, now run them, right? This is a reproducibility problem, right? The literature is not reproducible. We don't have the source code. It's not easy for us to kind of take these heuristics and test them out in new spaces. And so what ends up happening, right, in practice is that folks are actually, rarely re-implementing heuristics. When they publish a new heuristic, they kind of in their paper, they have a table that looks at, these are the results of this previous publication, right? These are their solution qualities and the runtimes on the test bed. Here's mine, it's run on different hardware because I didn't have their code, and let's kind of put them side by side and compare. And we see that actually folks are generally comparing against a very small number of heuristics and often on different hardware and with ultimately different runtime budgets because they're running on the different hardware. And this kind of all combines to just make it very challenging even on our kind of small homogeneous testbed, to really understand what is working best. And so I would say that we really see this as a reproducibility problem. A lot of the challenges with understanding what works best in literature come from the fact that the people are not publishing their heuristic source code when they're publishing the heuristics. And this is all sorts of kind of negative side effects, right? It's difficult, of course, to verify or extend others' results. That would have to start with a reimplementation effort. It's difficult to test out, previous heuristics on new instances, which is what we've been talking about, on new hardware. Tough to search for instances where all the heuristics don't work particularly well. And ultimately, fundamentally, these last 2 points are the key. We really can't answer this key question facing practitioners, which is, I have some problems. What works best when? What works best for my type of problem instances, right? And furthermore, even if we knew that, even if we knew the heuristic in the literature that works best for my types of problems, I don't have the source code, right? Practitioners can't actually run them even if they knew, right? And this really kind of combines to limit the impact of the heuristics literature. And so you could look at all this and say this is kind of a big, seems like a big problem. Or you could kind of look at it in a more positive view and say this looks like a fantastic opportunity, right, for us to do better, for us to kind of add some reproducibility, kind of implement up a bunch of heuristics from the literature, and get to the point where we really do know what works best when, and we put the heuristics in the hands of the practitioners. And that, in a nutshell, is really what we sought to accomplish in this work. And so basically, our approach is somewhat straightforward. We made a bigger instance library. We got much more diverse problem instances, right, to test on. We implemented up a boatload of heuristics from the literature, coded them up in C++, got them running, did a large scale evaluation. We ran all the heuristics on all this new big problem instance library. And that's really enables us to start asking these questions across kind of a diverse set of instances. Which heuristic is working best for what types of instances? And can we put really, in the hands of practitioners, maybe tell them what the best performing heuristic is predicted to be for their instance and let them run it. And we believe we've actually accomplished all this for MaxCut and a related problem. And I'll show you a demo actually in just a couple of slides. That's the notebook that I sent out that will allow you to kind of see this firsthand. And so I don't want to talk too briefly on kind of the details of our approach. I recognize we have somewhat limited time during here, but I'll just say we went through a pretty extensive effort to expand out the problem instance to get kind of a much broader set of problem instances. We pulled a bunch of real world problem instances that have been studied for other mathematical optimization problems. We built a bunch of random problem instances using a variety of different random graph generation approaches. And we ended up ultimately kind of pretty much at this point, no matter, we defined a whole bunch of different instance properties, characteristics of graphs. And kind of no matter which one you look at, pretty much, you have the same story where we have kind of this blue region, which is the standard test bed that people have been testing on historically. And the gray region, which is our new test bed, is kind of covering dramatically larger percentage of this space of instance characteristics, kind of pretty much no matter what instance characteristics you put on the X and Y axes. We released this instance library as open source, a couple thousand instances. It's accessible now on the Amazon cloud. And so with this, right, we're ready to start saying, okay, great, we think we kind of have a broad view of what sorts of problem instances people might run into. Now we need to see how all the heuristics we've looked at historically do on these, right? And so this was kind of a large literature review and reimplementation effort, right? We worked with a librarian, did a systematic literature review, reviewed hundreds of different publications from the literature, identified 95 papers presenting new heuristic approaches for MaxCut and this related problem called QUBO. And we ultimately selected 19 of these that are highly cited, impactful publications within the literature and implemented 37 total heuristics from them. And so I'll say a little bit more about that reimplementation on the next slide, but we tried to keep these as true to what the authors described in their papers as possible. We did make some modifications. Our experimental design required us to be able to run the heuristics for an arbitrary runtime limit. So often that meant wrapping some sort of a described procedure in random restarts or making other modifications to allow it to be run for an arbitrary runtime limit. One thing I want to highlight that's actually very nice about this is we're implementing all 37 of these. There's a lot of kind of shared ideas, a lot of shared thoughts, from one heuristic to another. And so we were actually able to share a lot of code and data structures in common across our implementations, which makes it kind of even more precise to compare them computationally. And then, we did the thing you'd expect. We have a bunch of running code. We fired up EC2, spent $1,000 and kind of ran all our heuristics across this large instance library. And then we put it all out as open source, right? So that others don't need to go through the same effort, right? The same re-implementation effort. And so we released open source implementations of all of these heuristics, right? As a Git repository, and then kind of actually, thanks very much to this challenge, because we got some great feedback that it would be helpful to release these as a Python package. And so we actually very recently, hot off the presses, have released a Python package, which you'll see in a moment in our notebook, our Jupyter notebook. It's a single line of code now in the pip repository to load this up as a package and get access to all this code. And then to make our own research reproducible, we also released all of our data and analysis scripts publicly as well. And so before I show you that notebook, I'm going to switch over to the notebook in just a moment. I want to say, I think we had kind of a number of key findings that we thought were nice and transferable in this re-implementation effort. We had a team of a couple different individuals, 3 to be exact, who were doing coding, checking each other's work a lot, making sure what we actually have in code really matches what's in the papers was really essential. We did do some modifications, as I said, to the heuristics, so taking some real care, using author's intent when it was kind of clear and possible to do that. But when we needed to make a change for our experimental design, if it was not clear exactly how to make that change, maybe testing out a couple of approaches and using the one that worked the best. One thing that I think was kind of a very important characteristic of our systematic evaluation was that we, we had no horse in the race. We weren't building the n+1 heuristic and comparing it against all these previous ones. So we kind of had no weird incentive to code up the previous ones less efficiently, but ours more efficiently, right? We were just trying to get efficient implications of all these heuristics so that we could make nice head-to-head comparisons and release them as open source, which I think was important. Reaching out to authors when in doubt, stress testing on very sparse, very dense, very large, very small instances. And I would say when in doubt, leave it out. We actually had a couple of heuristics that we built running implementations for, and we just weren't quite sure this was exactly what the authors wanted, and we ended up not including that at the end and not releasing that. And I think these were important things that helped us ultimately end up with a high quality comparison. And so with that, folks, I want to actually switch briefly and show you a bit of a demo of what kind of we've built and released as open source. So I'm switching to the Jupyter notebook that I sent a link to in the chat. There's also a rendered HTML version in the chat if you're not able to get it up and running. The only setup you have would be using pip to install our package. It has to be Python 3 for everything. There's no Python 2 implementation. So pip 3 and make sure you're running Python 3 in your notebook. But you can load it up very easily and kind of do normal Python things to maybe build a random graph that you want to run MaxCut on. So I've gone ahead and done that. And then this package, this MQLib package, allows you to very easily say, hey, what heuristics are implemented? What do I have accessible to me as a practitioner that I can run on my instance and solve MaxCut? And so we can ask and we see, okay, there's a whole bunch of these different heuristic codes with very brief descriptions of the types of heuristics that they're running. These are for MaxCut. And I said there's kind of this sister problem called QUBO. They're very easy to transform one to the other. So we also implemented up a bunch of QUBO heuristics from the literature, brief little descriptions. Okay, and so now if you're a practitioner, you got your network, right? You see here all of the different heuristics you can run. Maybe you define a little plotting function so that you can plot out a solution to the MaxCut problem. Using our packages is simple, right? As defining an instance within the package's terminology, calling run heuristic, which is going to pass one of these codes from up here. So I picked somewhat arbitrarily Beasley 1998 TS, which is one of our QUBO heuristics. We're actually running a QUBO heuristic to solve the MaxCut. Tell it how long you let it run, the number of seconds, give it a random seed and plot out your cut. And so there we go, it ran for a second, and it gave us a partition of the nodes into these two groups. Again, those red edges are the edges that are cut, the black ones are the ones that are not cut. how many red edges are there, that's the objective value. Right, so it's just a simple couple lines of code. Recall that the kind of before we did this, right, to get this, would have been, reading a paper and coding up their heuristic, right? Because this code just wasn't accessible previously. And so we can take this a step further, right? We can say, okay, great, let's build a larger problem instance. Now it is 1,000 nodes, not just 10. And let's build up an instance, a new, MaxCut instance. And let's run it across every single MaxCut and QUBO heuristic that's presented across, in this entire library, right? So we got all the codes, we loop through them all. We give each one 1 second, right, to run. And we're saying, hey, give us the objective value for each one of them. So this is, I guess that's going to take about 37 seconds to run to give us this kind of breakdown of the heuristic qualities. And there we go. Great. And so we have each of these has now been run. So we have, for this particular instance, giving each of these a second, what was the objective value they ended up accomplishing? So we see we have some things up in the 3,500s. We have some quite a bit lower than 3,500. We can see that actually for this case, selecting between these 37 heuristics was important, right? You could do a little bit better, a little worse. Again, right, before this project, doing this would have involved a massive reimplementation effort, right? Coding up 37 different heuristics, but now it's just, a couple lines of code in Python. And so I would say, I'm going to talk very briefly toward the end of this talk about, like, ideally, right, we wouldn't have to ask practitioners for their problem instance to run all 37 heuristics and see which one works best and use that one. Ideally, we could guide them, toward, for your problem instance, it seems like a heuristic that's going to be particularly promising is this one. And we actually use machine learning to do just that. We basically calculate a bunch of properties of the instances, predict based on our work, our computational efforts, which heuristic is going to work the best, and then just run that one. And so that is a special code, HH, for hyperheuristic. And that's basically, you give it the instance, you give it a runtime limit, you say, hey, use machine learning to figure out what you think is going to be best and run that one. And we really think this is exactly what practitioners are looking for, right? Just, hey, you tell me what from the literature is going to be best for my instance, run it and give me the results. And we can get an objective value there. And so we sent out the notebook, you can play around with it, but we think this really unlocks, in some sense, this literature, which was hidden away in PDF files behind paywalls, and now really enables practitioners to run the heuristics and get the results quite easily. Okay, and so I know I don't have too much more time, and I want to leave time for Q&A, but I do want to briefly talk about what we've unlocked, right? This hyperheuristic and this idea of zeroing in on what heuristic do we think works best for a particular type of instances. So I would say, kind of at a very high level, our computational experiments found that, hey, when you look at a diverse enough set of instances, no heuristic dominates all the other ones. Most heuristics had some instance where it was the very best heuristic, and it wasn't tied with anything else. It was strictly the best. And we also found that problem instances could really predict where a heuristic works well or poorly. So here I have, for a particular heuristic, I've plotted on the X and Y axis 2 important problem instance characteristics and predicting where it works well or poorly. And we see that, when MIS, this instance property that we've defined, when it's large, these are easy instances for this heuristic. It does well. It ranks near the best amongst all the heuristics. It has a lot of trouble when MIS is low. You'd probably want to pick a different heuristic. And so in our paper, we fit cart trees. We do some, data visualization to try to help folks understand where heuristics and heuristic ideas, characteristics of heuristics work well or poorly. But we think, again, for practitioners, probably the most important thing is that we then use machine learning, right? Basically fit random forest models to predict, hey, given a particular instance, which heuristic do we think works best? We see that this actually outperforms, right, any single heuristic. And so really this, you can call it an algorithm portfolio or hyperheuristic, represents a state-of-the-art MaxCut and QUBO heuristic. It kind of outperforms any single one from the literature. And again, this is completely accessible to folks who want to run it themselves, practitioners. And so I just want to wrap up by saying kind of our goal was twofold. It was to impact how researchers for MaxCut and QUBO are evaluating their heuristics, add reproducibility to that literature, and then very importantly, to get this in the hands of practitioners. We've already started seeing, this is obviously recent work, we've already started seeing some broader impacts. You know, the physicists, right, with their spin Hamiltonians are using MQLib to solve instances, right? You know, mining optimal policies in pattern recognition. We've seen an e-commerce application. Again, practitioners who had a MaxCut or a QUBO come up and they use the MQLib to solve it. I think one pretty interesting one that I would say when we started out on the project, we didn't really expect to have come up, but that has come up a lot. Probably the most interest from practitioners has been in quantum computing, right? There's this this concept that we want to identify problem instances for these NP-hard problems where classical algorithms, the ones we implemented in our approach, work poorly, but quantum computers work well. And so actually there's been kind of a flurry of, you know, preprints, but also like emails we're getting and stuff asking about this library, you know, folks trying to understand, okay, how do we best get access to the best classical algorithms so that we can identify, you know, where are the situations where quantum has an advantage to motivate quantum, which is cool. So here's one of those preprints that's just coming out, folks using our work, which is quite encouraging. And so I guess I'll stop here and just say that we think that this kind of adding reproducibility to this literature, getting these previous approaches coded up in the hands of practitioners and in the hands of researchers has numerous benefits, and ultimately will kind of make the comparisons that we are doing within this literature better, but then also really benefit practitioners as well. And so with that, folks, I will stop and would love to answer questions. I don't know now or at the end.
Yeah, if anyone has quick questions, please do drop them in the Q&A or the chat box. I'll ask you a couple questions, short questions, and then we'll move on to Nigel unless we see audience questions. At the end, we can, we'll go back to Q&A again after Nigel's talk as well. So I just want to ask you two quick questions. One is, it's a large number of literature to go through to get, you know, the results. In those literature, do you see anything that changes over time that tells you that people are getting more sophisticated with this?
Oh yeah, God, Jane, I'll tell you, the amount of time it took to code those first ones, it was like this, super easy. They just get so sophisticated by the end. You know, these various kind of nested heuristics within heuristics and all this stuff. So yeah, for sure there's complexity, and this, I think this is kind of natural. It's what you'd expect. I mean, in some sense, the heuristics literature has an aspect of horse racing to it, where to publish, you need to be able to beat people. And so if all kind of the easy ideas are tapped out, you need to think about kind of stacking ideas on top of ideas. And so we actually think that kind of, by expanding out the problem instance library to a much more diverse set of instances, we're really hoping that folks are going to kind of be writing papers that focus in on just one particular type of instances where they think we're not doing well, and they can establish they can do much better on those instances. But yeah, a lot more sophistication in recent years for sure.
So Karen Coulter asked a question, are users able to integrate their own heuristics to evaluate them against the published set that you selected?
We would be so jazzed if folks did, yes. We have a whole developer guide in our Git repository. That's C++ coding. The Python is just a wrapper around the C++ code, but yes, absolutely. And I would say that package developers would be thrilled to interact with anyone who wanted to integrate in their own heuristics. We would be really thrilled. This is a big reason why we built this, was for people to keep expanding it and making it kind of a living code repository.
Great, it's really interesting. All right, thanks very much for another very interesting presentation. So I'm gonna ask the audience members to put their questions down at this point in Q&A or chat, either way is fine. Meantime, let me ask you guys each a question. So for Nigel, what I want to know is this kind of effort, you know, trying to help people choose the right tools and make sense of, you know, so many black boxes out there, in a sense. So I would imagine there actually a lot of groups trying to do this, or they're trying to, work things out for themselves and then benefit the community along the way. So are we replacing a set of black boxes with another set of black boxes?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. Sorry, I can let you finish.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess the simple answer is probably yes in a certain context, right? If we're providing an interface for people to, without thinking, start to generate plots, and with those plots generate hypotheses about their data, then you're absolutely correct, right? It's just become a much larger black box that contains other black boxes. I guess one of the counterpoints / advantages of our approach is that we've not re-implemented anything. And so while we've put this box around other black boxes, we've not tried to recode anything from ScanPy or recode anything from other authors. We're just providing an interface for people who probably don't have, quite frankly, don't have the programming chops to sit down at the terminal and spend a week or two figuring out how to filter cells and get them asking meaningful questions about their data set. Because in our view, the analysis steps, while important, are only part of the equation. Really, what needs to happen is we need to get to a point in our analysis where we can start forming new biological hypotheses and testing them back in the tissue. There's no better way to ensure that your analysis is correct and reproducible than going back to the biology and making sure that what you think your analysis is telling you, black box or not, is actually what's happening. Because even if I understand how these algorithms work, but that doesn't give me any extra confidence that my analysis is correct in this context. I could go through other examples from that paper that we just put out, but there's a number of circumstances where we see basically cell type clustering that doesn't match the literature. And it's only resolvable by going back to the tissue, looking at the actual spatial expression profiles of these genes and rectifying that with the literature. The analysis on its own is only a stepping point. So yeah, it's a mixed bag. Definitely it's not where the story ends, but I think it will be useful nonetheless.
Yeah. So sort of a follow-up question for both teams, I guess, is this kind of helps others to improve reproducibility is important, but also it's hard because there aren't a lot of resources specifically funding for this kind of work. So for I think, what I mean is whether you intend to work with places like, our own bioinformatics core or other places to, sort of both to seek resource, but also to make your work more sort of widely used by others. And for John's group, I also wonder whether you guys had any funding support or anything for this, or did you guys just realize, let's just go over 810 papers and see where they did well and where they didn't do well.
We were very enthusiastic PhD students, but actually, I think Swati can speak quite a bit to kind of funding related follow-ups to that.
So this is an excellent question, and I think there's some NSF programs now that are going more towards building benchmarks and building packages and open sourcing, and this is something that we often see in NSF proposals, that you have to have a broader research dissemination. You have to actually say that you're open sourcing or you're releasing the code bases that are developed even as a part of theoretical research. So there is definitely a push from the funding agencies. But the amazing part about this research, even though we did not have funding to start this, once we did all of this work, this got picked up in a DARPA project actually for quantum computing. And DARPA gave our team like some $9 million. For the benchmarking part is small. It's mostly to build a quantum computer, but it was quite amazing that this work, even though we started with more the reproducibility aspect in our mind and thinking about bringing this research more transparent and bringing it across to the broader field. I think as Nigel actually put it very nicely. The initial name for our project was graph conjecture generator. So we wanted to do all of this analysis also to understand, what are, where do algorithms work well, or can we find, counter examples to conjectures in graph theory. So it was more of a diagnostic tool, and then it sort of went into this amazing reproducible code base.
So for my part, it's a great question. I was very lucky to have the opportunity to kind of develop this on my own while working on another project in the lab. But for continued development, you're right. So there's not an enormous amount of support that at least I can identify for my specific problem. I know the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation has funded similar projects. And they fund like ScanPy, the core of my analysis. I won't, reveal all the details, but my plan to actually continue this in the future is actually to try to commercialize this as a service. So the code is all open source, but hopefully by having people adopt a small subscription fee for a convenience service, I'll be able to fund continued development after I leave the lab in the future. I don't know how it's going to go. I'm not a business person, but there is not a ton of support that I've seen anyway. So I think that I'm just going to try and bootstrap it and see what I can put out there for the next couple of years. And worst case scenario, it'll just be a somewhat more developed tool that will sit in the open source, repos forever. So yeah.
So do you guys, both of the groups, do you guys? So basically, I think what I'm trying to get at is this kind of trying to standardize, the analysis and so forth. I think they're more useful for, I would say, inexperienced users, right, than veterans in the field. But on the other hand, the shared tools, usually pose a bigger challenge for beginning users than sophisticated users, right? So I think you guys each touched on a little bit on that, like Nigel was saying, make everything, into a, sort of button push sort of thing. And then that also brings the question of how people actually know they did it right. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, maybe it's a little bit too bold or too brash, but mine most simply is they know they did it right when they go back to the biological tissue and they see that the interpretation of their data based off of the button push, as we call it, is correct or incorrect, and they revise it as such. When I did my project and my paper, I was still learning all of this kind of on my own. And I think that for the most part, I and my advisor used all of the analysis that we did just as a stepping off point for actually going back to the real world. And so, quite frankly, I don't really care if it's right or wrong. I mostly care that it's useful enough that someone can make a meaningful hypothesis that they can go and test. And for me, that's all it means. But that's not necessarily appropriate for every context.
So I think what might be useful, Nigel, if you want a broader adoption of your tool, might be to post some sanity check questions which are very obvious to you, but they may not be obvious to other users who are inexperienced, right? Like sometimes some of these prompts are just very useful. Mm-hmm. I have been working with some doctors, and the hematocratin levels and all of that just goes above my head. But sometimes we can look at charts and figures and interpret and talk about if this even makes sense, or if right. And
that's a great idea. Yeah, I know I've put some of those little prompts or tutorial helps when you select parameters. I tell people, you know, what does this parameter kind of modify? But when you actually think about interpreting the data, yeah, it would be great to have some kind of example sanity checks. Yeah, it's a great idea.
And to maybe follow up a little bit on Jing's question. So what I've found to be successful in the past, and also talking to a bunch of colleagues who actually are into developing code bases, is to give people very interesting applications that they can parse. So, you know, maybe the application is, you know, finding a bunch of authors who have similar names on a Google Scholar profile for MaxCut, for instance. You know, if this is the application and you have some CVs that people can simply open and check, and then they can convert that into the mathematical problem, then sometimes having some of these applications completely worked out in the package just have a wider, help the wider use and accessibility of code bases. And this is what we've also seen in some of the Julia packages. So, and maybe Ian can add onto that more. But for some of the convex jail package, which is super technical to use, even for people who are pretty comfortable with optimization, I think that the key engagement point was to give them applications from finance or, you know, very meaningful, parsable, like tangible ideas. And or social, like right now, algorithmic fairness is a pretty big topic of discussion across multiple areas and fields, applications. And I think if we can just expand that to have, you know, where people feel like, you know, they're not just learning something that's super technical, but even having an impact on the society. Those would be my best approaches, guides to having a wider accessibility to people who don't appreciate the technical details.
Okay, so I don't see any question from the audience at this time, and since time is up, let's just wrap up here and thank you all very much for this wonderful presentation, but mostly for the wonderful work that you guys have been doing. And this time, for us to offer this reproducible challenge really was, I mean, for us, really was a great opportunity to see what creative ideas and all the hard work that people have been doing. And it's really very, very inspiring. So thank you all.
Thank you, Jing.
Thank you for organizing it. Appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.